Awaiting command for Part 2. The parasitic transition. The machine that once produced wealth is now producing something else. A manufactured, legally mandated scarcity designed to protect asset values at the expense of human biology. We are told that the housing emergency is an accidental collision of high interest rates and unfortunate planning bottlenecks. The data reveals a far more deliberate transformation. The traditional real estate market has been structurally re-engineered to function as an extractive utility, where the primary objective is no longer the provision of shelter, but the generation of risk-free yields for institutional investors. What we are witnessing is the absolute financialization of the basic space required to stand upright. This transition relies on a precise state-sanctioned mechanism, the deliberate contraction of municipal housing alternatives, alongside the deregulation of private landlord cartels. For 3 decades, public capital investment in nonprofit municipal housing has been held near zero, forcing 100% of the lowest income tier into the private rental sector. This was not a policy failure. It was a structural handover. By removing the public alternative, the state granted private capital absolute monopoly over the local rental market. When shelter becomes a monopoly asset, price ceases to reflect quality or local wage realities. It reflects the absolute maximum extraction the market can bear before physical collapse. The primary symptom of this parasitic shift is the complete decoupling of property values from the productive economy. In a healthy industrial system, housing costs track average local earnings. In the current model, housing costs are indexed to global debt markets and speculative portfolio valuations. The laborer is no longer paying for a roof. They are paying the interest on a highly leveraged corporate asset portfolio. This mechanism ensures that every efficiency gain in the workforce, every extra hour of overtime, is immediately absorbed by escalating baseline costs. The machine does not break down, it functions exactly as intended, transferring the fluid energy of human labor into the fixed balance sheets of a rentier class. The metrics of attrition, the structural reality of this transition, is recorded in the cold metrics of municipal attrition. Across England's major urban centers, the physical composition of neighborhoods is shifting as lower-income residents are systematically purged by the pricing mechanism. In Bristol, the average monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment in the private sector reached $1,734 by the second quarter of 2026, representing an 84% increase against the median local take-home wage over a 5-year period. The human consequence of this metric is immediate. An ordinary nurse or delivery driver must allocate up to 70% of their post-tax income merely to clear the threshold of a formal tenancy, leaving them a single utility spike away from total destitution. Simultaneously, the commercial fabric of these communities is undergoing an identical hollow out. High street retail vacancy rates in areas adjacent to high-density vehicle encampments have escalated to an unprecedented 22.4%. Independent grocery stores, laundromats, and community hubs are rapidly disappearing, replaced by high-interest pawnbrokers and automated storage facilities. The human consequence is the creation of commercial deserts where families living in vehicles cannot access fresh food or basic hygiene services within a walking radius, forcing them to burn scarce fuel simply to locate affordable sustenance. Urban Tenancy Purge, 2026 metrics. Core Rental Index. Bristol one-bed average 184% versus median wage. High street decay. Local commercial vacancy rate saw purge of independent infrastructure. Social stratification. Local authority waiting list percent. Average delay 7.2 years. The backlog within local authority housing registries provides the final, definitive metric of this collapse. Waiting lists for municipal social housing have expanded by 114% nationwide since the implementation of the revised fiscal austerity mandates. The average wait time for a family classified as priority homeless now stands at 7.2 years. The human consequence of this systemic logjam is measured in children who will spend their entire primary school education inside temporary bed and breakfast rooms, commercial shipping containers, or the back seat of a family saloon. Completely severed from stability, the view from the pavement to understand how these numbers alter the daily trajectory of a life, one must look at the microeconomies operating beneath the shadow of the cranes. On the industrial fringes of Bristol, where the traditional brick warehouses are being systematically demolished to clear space for luxury build-to-rent complexes, the human casualties of the pricing mechanism are visible every morning at 6 a.m. Consider the operational reality of a local independent mechanic who has run a workshop in the district for 24 years. His business survives by servicing the commercial vans and delivery vehicles that keep the city's logistics network functioning. 2 years ago, his commercial lease was acquired by an overseas asset management firm. His rent was instantly advanced by 140% under a mandatory market alignment clause. To survive, he had to lay off his apprentice and increase his hourly labor rates, a move that inadvertently priced out his traditional working-class clientele. Now, his primary customer base has shifted to the four-wheeled citizen class parked along the adjacent canal towpath. He spends his mornings retrofitting ordinary trade vans with crude diesel night heaters, cutting vent holes into the roofs of family estates, and repairing the depleted alternators of vehicles that double as permanent shelters. He observes the daily arrival of new vehicles. Not old rusted camper vans, but clean recent model hatchbacks belonging to school teachers, supermarket shift managers, and municipal office workers who pull into his yard asking for temporary battery charges so their children can use laptops for homework. His workshop has transformed from a productive industrial business into an ad hoc emergency service station for a community in freefall. He watches parents in high-visibility work uniforms clean their children with wet wipes in the shadow of his hydraulic lifts before walking them toward the school gates. The local economy he anchored for 2 decades has been completely dismantled. It no longer supports the reproduction of the local community, but merely manages the physical decline of a workforce that has been priced out of the very city it services. The blueprint of extraction, this structural decline, is not a random, localized anomaly unique to the post-industrial geography of England. It is a highly coordinated pattern of asset extraction that follows a blueprint visible across every major Western economy that has prioritized real estate financialization over industrial production. The mechanisms operating in Bristol, the weaponization of no-cause eviction loopholes, the deliberate starvation of municipal housing budgets, and the aggressive criminalization of the unhoused are identical to the policy frameworks deployed in the highly commodified urban centers of the American West Coast, the hyperinflated rental markets of Dublin, and the gentrified zones of Berlin. The pattern is precise. First, the state deregulates the private housing market to attract global institutional capital, presenting the resulting asset inflation as a metric of national economic health. Second, when the local population can no longer afford the entry price of shelter, the state permits the expansion of predatory consumer debt to artificially sustain the rental market. Third, when the debt capacity of the working class is entirely exhausted, and they spill over into alternative survival structures like vehicles, the legal apparatus pivots from economic management to active containment, utilizing police forces to physically remove the evidence of systemic failure from the view of the investing class. This is the global macrostructural trajectory of the 21st century renty economy. The traditional city is no longer a site for social cohabitation or industrial innovation. It has been repurposed into a vast, vertical safety deposit box where the physical presence of the working population is tolerated only to the extent that their wages can be directly extracted to service property debt. The four-wheeled citizen class is not an accidental byproduct of a temporary recession. It is the logical endpoint of an economic model that has chosen to liquidate its own social fabric to preserve the balance sheets of a financial monopoly. This machine does not slow down, it expands, and the patterns of its advancement are already hardening into permanent statutory concrete. The architecture of denial, a profound paradox, sits at the heart of the contemporary British landscape. The more pervasive a social collapse becomes, the more aggressively it is filtered out of institutional language. To walk through a public park or an industrial estate in 2026 is to witness an overt physical reconfiguration of human survival. The rows of modified vehicles are not hidden. They occupy the direct line of sight of municipal offices and commercial high streets. Yet, to read the official economic assessments, white papers, and ministerial briefings is to enter a parallel reality where this population does not exist. The state handles structural destitution not by resolving it, but by managing its visibility. This denial is not passive. It is a highly active bureaucratic process. The state apparatus utilizes a refined vocabulary of euphemism to neutralize the gravity of the crisis. Displacement is categorized as housing fluidity. The inability to afford a tenancy is framed as a lifestyle preference for flexible accommodation, and the systematic failure of the welfare safety net is described as the optimization of local authority resources. This linguistic insulation serves a distinct structural purpose. By stripping the crisis of its physical reality in official reports, the governing institutions insulate themselves from the legal and moral obligations codified in international human rights frameworks. The visible evidence on the street is treated as an optical illusion, an anomalous dataset that fails to align with the state's self-reported trajectory of recovery. The silenced data beneath the surface of this official narrative lies a pervasive, chilling effect that deliberately suppresses the collection and publication of accurate social metrics. Within the civil service and local government authorities, an unwritten consensus has formed. Data that visualizes the true velocity of working-class impoverishment is routinely delayed, re-baselined, or classified under restrictive methodology. Municipal housing officers report privately that the criteria for recording hidden homelessness have been intentionally tightened. If an individual holds a full-time employment contract, some local authorities automatically disqualify them from emergency housing registries, effectively erasing them from the statutory headcount. The data is not being lost. It is being systematically spun to preserve market confidence. This institutional silence extends to the victims themselves, who operate under a compounding weight of fear. The four-wheeled citizenry are not merely hiding from the winter wind. They are hiding from the very mechanisms designed to monitor public health. Families living in vehicles actively avoid registering with local general practitioners or enrolling their children in neighborhood schools out of an acute fear of statutory intervention. The mechanism of chilling effect, 2026, Park institutional level, redefining homelessness metrics to artificially suppress headcounts, individual level avoidance of public services, NHS schools, due to fear of child removal, media level, displacing investigative structural journalism with sanitized van life narratives. Under current emergency welfare mandates, a lack of a fixed brick-and-mortar address can be interpreted by social services as a prima facie indicator of child neglect. The human consequence is devastating. Parents choose to treat chronic pediatric illnesses with over-the-counter medication inside a damp vehicle cabin rather than risk a hospital visit that could trigger a safeguarding review and the subsequent removal of their children. The system has effectively weaponized its care infrastructure, transforming public services into instruments of surveillance that enforce silence through the threat of familial separation. The broader erosion, if this trajectory of structural abandonment and aggressive criminalization is permitted to continue unchecked, the implications extend far beyond the immediate degradation of the unhoused demographic. We are witnessing the progressive hollowing out of the nation's foundational social contract. When the state establishes a legal precedent where full-time productive labor no longer guarantees the minimum physical space required to preserve human life, the moral legitimacy of the economic system dissolves. The traditional incentive structure of an industrial society relies on a basic promise that compliance with the labor contract yields security. When that promise is permanently broken, the psychological baseline of the working class shifts from participation to survivalism. The regional consequences are already hardening into geographic realities. Entire metropolitan zones are transforming into hyper-stratified enclaves where the essential workforce, the teachers, the sanitation laborers, the emergency service personnel, can no longer afford to live within 50 miles of their operational stations. This spatial apartheid creates a highly unstable municipal infrastructure. Cities become increasingly fragile, relying on a transient, exhausted commuter class that spends 4 hours a day traversing the periphery, sleeping in vehicles between consecutive shifts because the cost of fuel outpaces the cost of daily transit. The long-term consequence is not a sudden dramatic collapse of the urban center, but a slow entropic decline. Public services degrade because staff retention becomes impossible. Community cohesion fractures as neighborhoods are stripped of long-term residents, and the national psyche becomes deeply traumatized by the constant, ambient presence of a state that criminalizes its own casualties. The unbroken loop, the legal machinery, and the economic vice continue to turn in unison, each reinforcing the other in an unbroken loop of extraction and displacement. The state's financial architecture remains entirely locked into the preservation of property asset values. prioritizing the liquidity of institutional lenders over the physical survival of the population that funds the Treasury. Every enforcement action taken under the PCSC Act, every vehicle shredded by order of a municipal court, and every punitive fine issued by a privatized security contractor does nothing to add a single brick to the national housing stock. It merely increases the density of the hidden population, forcing the four-wheeled citizenry to recede deeper into the industrial shadows, further from the reach of support, and closer to absolute destitution. The fundamental mechanics of this crisis are now fully exposed. This is not a temporary malfunction of the British dream, nor is it a minor cyclical correction in a self-balancing market. It is a permanent structural realignment of society, a deliberate calculation that values the stability of speculative capital over the biological necessity of human shelter. As the winter of 2026 deepens and the low hum of idling engines continues to echo across the unlit corners of the nation's public car parks, the state continues to refine its legal codes to ensure that poverty remains invisible to the investing class, which leads to the final, unavoidable question that hangs over the entire architecture of this society. When the last vehicle is confiscated, when the final loophole is closed, and when the last four-wheeled fortress of the working poor is systematically crushed by the state, where exactly does the system expect its workforce to go?